graduate nurses at the turn of the 20th century. Their placid faces and posed bodies belie the opportunities and challenges before them. It would be up to these women to establish a new profession of nursing within a society going through cataclysmic changes. Women were entering the workforce in record numbers at the turn of the century. Sweatshops and factories teemed with adults and children pursuing the American dream away from the family farm. Immigrants flooded our shores, full of hope, and usually ending up in overcrowded, unsanitary tenements. This era saw the birth of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Temperance Crusade. The field of medicine was going through its own revolution. The discovery of the germ theory and advances in surgery resulted in a boom in patient population and hospital construction. The increased need for nurses brought opportunities for both advancement and exploitation. In 1890, there were 35 nurse training schools in this country. Just 10 years later, there were nearly 400 programs available. There was a recognized need for reform.
The education of nurses was in utter chaos. There were small schools, there were big schools, there were prestigious schools, and there were schools in small sanitariums. Physicians were beginning to open small hospitals and recognized nurses as a cheap form of labor and began to open training schools. So you might have a 20-bed hospital with a training school for nurses. The superintendents of nursing schools were very concerned about the state of nursing. They felt there was no uniform curriculum. There was no standardization of training. There was competition between the nurses who were trained from the prestigious schools and the nurses who had come out of 10-week correspondence courses and called themselves trained nurses. So there were all manner of nurses working, and there was no distinction between the trained nurse who came out of a 2-year school and a nurse who came out of one of these sanitariums or one of the correspondence schools. And yet they were competing for the same jobs.
Isabel Adams Hampton, the superintendent of the prestigious nursing school at Johns Hopkins Hospital, was among an elite group of nursing leaders who responded to these problems. In 1893, she called on other nurse educators to join her at the Chicago World's Fair. There, they addressed the needs of nursing and the community at the International Congress of Charities, Correction, and Philanthropy. It was time to act. Nurses needed to come together to protect the community from untrained nurses and to save their own jobs. Edith Draper, the superintendent of the Illinois Training School, delivered a rousing speech at the World's Fair on the necessity for an American Nurses Association.
The difficulties to be encountered, one must truthfully admit, will be mainly of our own manufacture. What we need is energy of purpose, enthusiasm, a spirit of philanthropy more developed, and ambition to lift our profession to a height which the eyes of the nation shall look up and not down. To advance, we must unite.
The planted seed took root. 3 years later, women from 10 nursing school alumni associations came together to form a national organization for rank-and-file nurses. The Nurses Associated Alumni of the United States and Canada was born on September 3, 1896. 15 years later, its name would be changed to the American Nurses Association. Isabel Hampton Robb was the ANA's first president. Trained at Bellevue Hospital after a successful career as a teacher, Isabel Hampton went on to be superintendent of nurses at the Illinois Training School. She made a name for herself there, fighting for the development of a standardized curriculum.
She believed that nurses had to have a firm understanding of the knowledge base necessary for nursing. She also believed that it was very important for nurses to have a full and complete life, and that they should not just be carriers out of orders, but that they should have some sense of autonomy in their own way. Isabel Hampton had a vision about an American Nurses Association Back when she was at the Illinois Training School, she had a dream. She would think about this kind of thing at night. She wanted nurses to be united, to be standardized, so that everyone would know who a nurse was, and that nurses themselves would know who they were. She didn't like the fragmentation. She didn't like the infighting. She wanted them to be a united voice and a united force.
The fledgling organization set the establishment of a code of nursing ethics as a top priority. But the ANA leaders quickly recognized that as a long-term project. Instead, they turned their most focused attention to a state-by-state effort to protect their jobs and the public from untrained nurses. They got licensure laws put on the books.
For nurses to get legislation passed was an enormous challenge. The women that were members of the Superintendent Society, women in general, didn't have a vote. They had very little political know-how. There was no formal lobbying kinds of strategies in existence then. Yet they were able to pull together and state by state achieve laws. Those laws were very weak laws, but it was a beginning for nursing.
The American Journal of Nursing, first published in 1900, was an integral part of the registration and licensure effort. Seeing a need to reach a scattered membership, nursing leaders took it upon themselves to form a private company to publish the journal. Sophia Palmer, a superintendent of nurses in Rochester, New York, is credited with giving the journal and nursing a foundation for long-term success.
She took on the editor-in-chief position of the American Journal of Nursing when it first began in 1900, a position she retained for about 20 years, I believe. It was her editorials in the American Journal of Nursing that focused on registration for nurses, and she hammered away and she got the word out, and she was responsible for giving presentations at women's groups, alerting the public to the necessity for registration laws for nurses. And in my judgment, she was a very important leader in that era.
African American nurses, or colored nurses, as they were called at the turn of the century, faced even more daunting challenges. The Supreme Court upheld the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the same year the ANA was founded. Some colored nurses, relegated for the most part to separate and often inferior schools and hospitals, did belong to the ANA through their alumni associations. The ANA did not address issues of discrimination. Martha Franklin, a colored graduate of Women's Hospital in Philadelphia, refused to stand for the status quo. She reached out to other colored graduate nurses.
It took her 2 years to write 1,500 letters to as many black nurses throughout the country to find out if they were experiencing any discrimination. Evidently, she was experiencing some. So she wondered about what was happening. She issued a call for a meeting to all the nurses that she could contact, and 52 of them came to this meeting, this founding meeting in 1908 in New York City. And Ms. Franklin was elected president, and the name decided on was the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. That was 1908.
The NACGN fought discrimination on 3 fronts: education, employment, and organized nursing. This mission became even more crucial when the ANA became a federation of district and state associations in 1916. ANA membership no longer came through an alumni association.
And it was at that time that the southern states refused to accept blacks into the association. So the 16 southern states and the District of Columbia, 17 units, denied membership to black nurses, thereby keeping them out of the American Nurses Association.
Public health nursing expanded the profession's horizons in many ways. Born in the era of social reform, public health nurses worked out of settlement houses established among overcrowded inner-city tenements. Education and disease prevention were cornerstones of the practice. Nurses responded directly to the needs of the community.
It was a golden age in that nurses moved into independent roles and made clinical and critical decisions about patient care, referred to physicians when necessary, but truly were the primary caregivers. Those who were based in hospitals, as years went by, nurses, I think, in many ways gave up much of the independence and much of the decision-making power that they had once captured during that particular period.
Lillian Wald was the major figure in the development of public health nursing. Wald's baptism by fire occurred during a visit to New York's Lower East Side. She single-handedly raised money to cover her salary and that of a friend for a 6-month period. A new movement was begun.
Lillian Wald was a unique individual in that she was truly a liberated woman in both her philosophy, in her spirit, in her motivation for social reform.
In 1912, the ANA helped establish the National Organization for Public Health Nursing. The NOPHN was the major force in developing the public health movement. They helped establish agencies. They developed educational curricula and set up an accreditation system for public health programs.
Its leaders recognized that a 3-year hospital-based diploma education was not sufficient for practice in the community. There needed to be a knowledge of culture, of people, of political systems. And so as a result of this need, educational programs to prepare nurses in universities were developed. And so I see public health nursing itself as being a major factor in moving nursing education along the trajectory that we have experienced over the last several decades.
21,000 American nurses served in World War I, 10,000 of them overseas. 30 nations were involved in the struggle over European nationalism. 8 million lives were lost in the war to end all wars. Shock wards, the precursor to today's intensive care units, began to be used routinely during World War I. Some credit the recognition and treatment of shell shock as the beginnings of modern psychiatric nursing. Nursing had a very heroic image during World War I. Nurses were angels of mercy, responding to a call that was almost religious in nature. That was a cause for concern among nurse leaders.
There was really such patriotic fervor. Women wanted to serve the fighting man, but many women did not have that education. And just because you may profess or think you are a nurse isn't the same as being an educated nurse. So the American Nurses Association, American Red Cross, and the Army Nurse Corps basically got together and said these are the basic standards for nurses who would serve overseas.
The 3 organizations were able to come together in large part because of the efforts of Jane Delano. Superintendent of the Army Nurse Corps and president of the ANA, Delano resigned her Army position in 1912 to devote herself full-time to the Red Cross. By that time, the Red Cross nursing services required its members to belong to the ANA. At first glance, the statuesque and dignified Delano looked somewhat foreboding. In reality, she was down to earth and caring. The Surgeon General's staff called her Aunt Jane. She was, however, a mother wolf when it came to her nurses.
At Walter Reed, a building was built in 1911, and that was the first time Army nurses went to Walter Reed Army Hospital. And she wanted the nurses' quarters to be put right at the front gate. And the other officers said, no, we have to put it behind the hospital. And she says, no, I won't have it behind the hospital. My nurses are perfectly well behaved, and they will be a credit to us if they are at the front gate. And then another gentleman piped up and said, but that's against the regulations. And Jane Delano replied, well, change the regulations. And she stomped out of the room, and everyone was terribly shocked, but they built the nurses' quarters right at the front gate. So they listened to her. She was a powerful woman.
There was another nurse who served her country with distinction during World War I. Her name was Julia Stimson. This Vassar graduate defied the wishes of her socially prominent family when she became a nurse. Stimson joined the Army Nurse Corps and was appointed Chief Nurse of Base Hospital 21, which served France. Her potential was obvious. Stimson became the Chief Nurse of the American Red Cross Service in France in 1918. Within 7 months, she became Director of Nursing Services of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe.
When she became American Red Cross chief nurse in Paris, she set up a uniform and an equipment bureau. And before that time, if you needed a new uniform, you just couldn't get it. You were stuck. She also did frequent inspection trips, which was sort of an innovation at that time. She'd go from hospital to hospital, which was a very difficult thing. Transportation was a problem. And she'd interview individual nurses and talk to the commander of the hospital and try to intervene for the nurses whenever she could.
After the war, Stimson was promoted to the grade of Major in the Army. She was the first woman to reach this rank, following the granting of relative rank for military nurses. The ANA had fought hard for the issue throughout the war campaign.
Nurses during World War I did not have any specific rank, and it was very confusing. They were addressed either as Miss if they were single, or if they were widow, as Mrs. And it was sort of a difficult situation. Were the women responsible for the care on the unit? The answer to that, of course, is yes. But could they give orders to male orderlies? It was kind of an interesting and a difficult situation. So that was one of the reasons why there was such a drive after the war to have rank provided for nurses. So be very clear within the military hierarchy where they stood.
Negro nurses did not serve in World War I. They were barred from the Army Nurse Corps because there were no separate housing quarters available. Movies began to dominate popular culture in the 1920s as Americans careened through the short-lived period of prosperity that followed World War I. The progressive era gave way to materialism. Automobiles became the new necessity. Women wore shorter hair and makeup. Even sedate young ladies wanted to look like Clara Bow. The suffrage movement had met with success. Finally granted the right to vote in 1920, women enjoyed newfound freedom and independence. Nurses in the ANA did not fall victim to what was then seen as the moral decay of the Roaring Twenties. In 1926, the ANA began to make good on its first priority, adopting a suggested code of ethics.
Is an incredibly lovely document. It represents the flower of the Victorian era in terms of its literary style. And probably because of that, at least in part because of that, it met its demise and was never accepted. As a suggested code, though, it mentions that at the conclusion that one of the tasks of nursing is to keep alight the flame of nursing for humanity. But something more important is found in that code, and what is more important that's found there is the central moral motif of nursing, and that is the ideal of service. And what that code says is that the most precious possession of this profession is the ideal of service, extending even to the sacrifice of life itself.
Nursing education became a major focus in the 20s and 30s following the publication of the Goldmark Report in 1923. It pointed out the shortcomings of nursing education and public health nursing. As a result, the ANA contributed money and effort to the Committee on the Grading of Nursing Schools. Its goal was to study actual working conditions and establish minimal education standards for each type of nursing service. The committee published 4 major reports over a period of 11 years.
The Goldmark report affected the state of nursing because schools then began to affiliate with colleges and universities so that nurses could have a broader education than was possible to give them in a hospital setting, so that it made the education much more complete and more rounded for the individual. And the Goldmark report really showed us or gave us the indication that because the role of the nurse was changing so, particularly among public health nurses and nurses who were working in the community, that they needed a much rounder and broader education to cope with the times that they were dealing with.
The Great Depression put the country into a tailspin. Within a period of 3 years, the United States went from riches to rags. By 1932, more than 14 million people were out of work. A near riot occurred in New York City when 5,000 people showed up to apply for 100 jobs. These nurses, testing out a somewhat novel hospital emergency escape system, were among the few who had jobs. Unemployment among nurses started well before the Depression and was particularly severe. There were too many nurses. Since 1900, the country's population had grown 62%. The number of trained nurses had increased over 2,000%.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work.
The New Deal program of relief, recovery, and reform provided job opportunities for millions of Americans. The National Recovery Act was passed in 1933. It reduced work hours, enabling people to share available jobs. The ANA fought for better working conditions for nurses as well, approving an 8-hour workday. This period spawned the development of community-based health departments, offering new and continuing opportunities for nurses. The precedent was set for governmental involvement in health care. The ANA worked hard to ensure that trained nurses were hired for these programs. World War II was a watershed event for nursing. This global conflict, involving 80,000 military nurses, changed the profession in ways we have yet to fully appreciate. And with war approaching, who better to be the president of ANA than Julia Stimson? As early as 1939, the American Journal of Nursing urged members to join the Red Cross Reserves. Stimson took the effort one step further.
Several years before the war in 1939, when it became obvious that we were going to war again, particularly in Europe, she formed what was called the Nursing Council for National Defense. And this was a group of leaders from the major nursing organizations and some of the government people, some of the Navy nurses and Army nurses. And what they did was try to survey nurses to see if we were ready to go to war, if we had enough. And they also tried to recruit nurses and fostered that activity. So, and really what they did is sort of interface between the professional organizations and the government.
Stimson re-entered the Army herself, crisscrossing the country to recruit nurses. The president of ANA through 1944, Stimson made sure the profession was prepared for what was ahead. Wherever the American soldier happened to be, there was a nurse nearby. American nurses came ashore in Normandy. They landed in North Africa. They served in the South Pacific. Nurses took care of soldiers in tents, in open fields, on hospital ships, and on airplanes. The skill and dedication of the military nurses contributed to an extremely low post-injury mortality rate. Fewer than 4% of the American soldiers who received medical care in the field or underwent evacuation died from wounds or disease.
During World War II, nurses were able to do much more than they had ever done before. Their scope of practice increased. They gave blood, they sutured in some cases, they triaged, they administered penicillin independently, so that they did a lot more than they ever did before. And not only that, many times they did it autonomously. Frequently there was not a physician there to okay or tell them what to do, and they went ahead and did it because they knew what was right.
Flight nursing developed in World War II, and it's very important to the growth of autonomy of nursing practice, and it also increased the scope of nursing practice. These women flying with the patients basically had to assume the role of almost like a medical officer. They had to understand what was going on with their patients, and for example, if a patient would go into respiratory arrest, they would have to resuscitate them. They'd have to make the decision if a patient should receive pain medication. So it's really a very important aspect showing the medical community how nurses can manage patients by themselves.
Oh yes, I was a much better nurse. After the war, I had had so much experience in different fields that you just knew what to do. I worked in orthopedic wards a lot, and we had mostly knee cases from the paratroopers that jumped, that injured their knees, and they were with us for 6 months almost, and you got to know them, and you knew what had to be done as soon as they came in. Didn't even have to wait for a doctor's order. You just did what was necessary.
Eva Donovan was a young graduate nurse working in Minneapolis on December 7, 1941. The announcement of the attack on Pearl Harbor sent her to the recruiting office. She signed up for the duration plus 6 months.
When we got into France, of course we were in tents. The ground was your floor, and it rained a lot. Of course there's a lot of mud all over. We wore galoshes and raincoats all the time, and slopped around in the mud, and it was well, fun, I guess you might say, in a way, but you got tired of it after a while. We worked as a team, and everybody knew what they had to do. The busier you got, the better it was. And you just worked. We worked 12 to 14 hours a day in our 1,000-bed tent hospital. Under complete tent coverage, everything was. It was, I suppose it was hard in today's version, but we didn't think it was that bad.
Throughout the war, the ANA pushed hard to obtain commissioned rank for military nurses. Relative rank, which was approved in 1920, gave nurses the same title and authority as commissioned officers. But relative rank denied them equal pay and benefits. 2 years after the war ended, the ANA's effort regarding commissioned rank was successful. Members of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses spent their war years fighting for the right of Negro nurses to serve in the military.
A quota system was set up by the Army, limiting the number of black nurses to 56. And this was in 1941. It was the housing. They had no place to house us. So when they did take them, then it was stipulated that they would take care of black soldiers in black camps. Now that's the Army. The Navy said, no, we will not take blacks at all. They finally broke down in January of 1945. Now that's the year that the war ended. And they took 4. They enlisted 4 black nurses. And they never had more than 4 throughout the whole war.
The quota system was dropped in 1945. The military was desegregated in 1948. The executive director of the NACGN was involved in both efforts.
We were lucky to have Mabel Stoppers, who was feisty enough to fight. She was really militant. Every time the president looked up in the White House, there was Miss Stoppers. But she did an awful lot.
The Cadet Nurse Corps was established to meet the overwhelming need for both civilian and military nurses during World War II. The Bolton Act, sponsored by Ohio Congresswoman Frances Payne Bolton, was signed into law in 1943. It created the Cadet Nurse Corps. The National Nursing Council for War Service was the driving force behind the Cadet Nurse Corps idea. The Cadet Corps helped take nursing and nursing education into the mainstream.
Congress has set up scholarships in most of the nursing schools throughout the country, so the girls get their tuition, room and board, and practically everything else. They even get a regular monthly spending allowance.
Well, how long is the course?
In some schools 2 years, and others 2.5, plus a senior cadet period.
An unprecedented public relations campaign was launched, linking the almost irresistible appeals of patriotism and glamour. 3 million posters were distributed. The promise of a free education in return for guaranteed nursing service brought in 65,000 recruits in the Corps' first year. A Hollywood-style recruitment film entitled Rewards Unlimited was produced and shown in 16,000 theaters.
Nurse training is more than just a war job. From now on, there'll be more and more need for good nurses, and I intend to be one of the best.
Nearly 125,000 nurse trainees completed the program by the time the Cadet Corps was disbanded in 1948. Minority nurses were significant benefactors. Over 3,000 blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans received their nursing education through the Cadet Corps. Nurses came away from World War II with a sense of pride and a clear demonstration of what their unified efforts could accomplish. Nurses no longer had to prove their worth. They wanted more for their profession. The activities of World War II set off a chain of events that affected working conditions, education, civil rights, and the very way the profession was run. There was a critical shortage of nurses following World War II. Many military nurses did not re-enter the field, in large part because of dreadful working conditions. Nurses were routinely paid $120 a month for 48-hour work weeks. There was no health insurance, little sick leave, and no mention of pension plans. This recruitment film drew on the nobility of nursing to entice new students into the field. It also made the most common pitch of all.
There is no better preparation for marriage and family life than nursing.
The ANA, on the other hand, took a more realistic and courageous approach to the nurse shortage. In 1946, the ANA made nursing history by passing a national economic and general welfare program. The plan called for improvements in hours and pay, increased participation in the planning of nursing services, and the recognition of state nurses associations as authorized bargaining agents.
Patient care was always a very important part of the issue. For example, when it became clear that nurses were leaving the profession and there weren't enough, we couldn't recruit because the salaries were so low. And we knew that, that patient care would suffer. And nurses have always been concerned about staffing, for example. Staffing not only because they wanted to be safe, but they wanted to be of some quality for patients.
The executive director of the California Nurses Association, Shirley Titus, was the driving force behind the program. She was well known for the impressive salary increases she garnered for California nurses during the war.
Shirley Titus was, I suppose some people would call her a revolutionary. She was courageous, she was very proud, and she was extraordinarily intelligent. And she couldn't stand the way nurses were treated. And she wanted them to be proud, she wanted them to have respect for themselves, and it was that really led her to push for some kind of economic and general welfare. And she believed in their right to representation, she believed in collective bargaining, she was absolutely determined it would be through the Nurses Association.
The unanimous vote approving the Economic and General Welfare Program gave increased power to state nurses associations, who took on the role of bargaining agent.
The employers of nurses, primarily hospital administrators, never really took the nurses seriously. They thought, oh, a bunch of women, they think they're going to do this, but it's not going to amount to much. But as a matter of fact, they were pretty surprised with the effort that was made and with the success that came about in those early days.
A long-term program of lobbying, litigation, and workplace advocacy was begun through the ANA. Over time, nurses gained Social Security benefits, unemployment compensation, protection from unfair labor practices, and the right to collective bargaining. The collaborative efforts of nurses and nursing organizations during World War II led to a major reshaping of the profession. In 1946, Raymond Rich Associates was hired to study the structure and functions of the 6 national nursing organizations. The goal was possible consolidation and reorganization.
One of the things we have to remember is that in those days, many of the people who were leaders in one organization were also leaders in other organizations. Leadership was not as diffuse as it is today. And so the leadership was able to come together, not without some arguments and some consternation, but come together around some structure studies to look at what the organizations might be if they were merged. As a result, some of the organizations dissolved, others merged, and after much discussion, we were then left with 2 organizations.
The reorganization was complete by June 1952. The ANA agreed to absorb the functions of the National Association for Colored Graduate Nurses. The National League for Nursing was created by the merger of the NLNE, the NOPHN, and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Nursing. The American Association of Industrial Nurses chose to remain autonomous. The National Student Nurses Association was also created that same year.
Working with the 2 organizations, I think, was a tremendous help in harnessing the resources and the energies and the leadership in order to move nursing to another stage of its development, not only in terms of clinical practice, but particularly in education. The American Nurses Association and the NLN as well certainly needs to be credited, and particularly ANA, with moving the agenda and moving nursing into colleges and universities and into the mainstream of higher education.
Despite the obvious inequities still existing in our society, the NACGN saw their work coming to an end by the time reorganization was underway. The military was desegregated following World War II. There was no need to keep fighting quotas. In 1948, direct membership in ANA was granted to Negro nurses barred from joining segregated state nursing associations. That same year, Estelle Osborne became the first Negro to be elected to the ANA's Board of Directors.
All of the things that NACGN had started, ANA was picking up and supporting. So we did not, I say we because I was one of them, we did not see the need for overlapping of functions. And many of us were members, also members of ANA. So we didn't see the need for that. So we felt that it would be better if we dissolved our organization. Why overlap functions and duplicate efforts doing the same thing that they were doing?
I have a dream that one day...
By the time of the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, all state nurses associations had agreed to accept all qualified RNs into membership, regardless of race, color, or creed. The ANA experienced a second coming of age in the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Definitive steps were taken to improve the practice of nursing. The American Nurses Foundation was established in 1955. Divisions of practice were organized in 1966 to support the evolution of advanced practice nursing. The Congress of Nursing Practice was established that same year. It was time to get involved nationally and take stands on issues affecting patient care, education, and public policy.
In 1958, the American Nurses Association took the position that all people should be covered by health insurance in this country. In effect, it was endorsing and supporting the idea of national health insurance. And at that time, so far as I can recall, no other health organization had that position. The ANA stood alone.
During ceremonies at Independence, Missouri, President Johnson brings up Medicare.
ANA was in the audience when President Johnson initiated the Medicare program in 1964. The ANA was a strong supporter of the first government-operated health insurance program for elderly Americans. The American Medical Association opposed the plan. In 1965, the ANA approved a position paper on education, stating that a baccalaureate degree should be the foundation for professional nursing practice.
So in 1965, there were no other organizations. And for the ANA to do this, knowing that the bulk of nurses were diploma school graduates, was an enormous risk to take. And I am proud as I think back at the committee for proposing that. And we had diploma school people and associate degree people on that committee. And for the board of directors to adopt it in December of 1965, and then for the ANA House of Delegates, which was at 1,200 plus membership in the House of Delegates at that time, so that for that House of Delegates to endorse the position was enormous.
The ANA was involved in the passage of the historic Nurse Training Act of 1964, which helped nursing become visible as an academic discipline. It provided construction grants for schools of nursing on college campuses.
On that day in September when President Johnson signed the Nurse Training Act, it was a great day for nursing. Nursing had never had legislation that was that comprehensive, that was potentially that influential on what would happen to nursing and nursing education in this country.
The ANA also found time to focus on the welfare of individual nurses. In 1964, an annual target wage for RNs was set at $6,000. The average salary at that time was $4,200 a year. The late 1960s and the early 70s were a turbulent time in this country. Race riots broke out in our large cities as minorities railed against barriers to full participation in society. There were protests over the war in Vietnam as young people challenged the status quo. 4 students were shot at Kent State University in 1970. The ANA was holding its convention at the same time. The organization was not spared this national angst. Events galvanized the formation of a social justice group which demanded changes, especially as they related to civil rights. In response, the ANA established an Affirmative Action Task Force in 1972. It was charged with bringing minority nurses into all aspects of the organization and the profession.
So we did a survey of all of the structural units in ANA. We did a survey of state nurses associations, and it was very evident that there was that lack of commitment. And based upon that assessment, the American Nurses Association, as well as the state nurses associations, began to really do an assessment of where they were and where they needed to be. It even got to the point where there was competition betwixt and amongst states because we gave an award to states who had the best affirmative action plan.
Well, I think when you compare ANA to other professions, for professional organizations, for example, medicine or physical therapy or social work, you'll find that the American Nurses Association has more cultural representation in terms of numbers than the other groups. And I think that this has been a concentrated, very purposeful effort to do this. And so I'm very pleased with what ANA has been able to accomplish. It doesn't mean that we don't have distance to go, but it does mean that when you compare us to other health provider groups, organizations, that we come out looking very strong.
The Ethnic Minority Fellowship Program has been one of the most successful outcomes of affirmative action. Established in 1974, it continues to provide financial support and mentoring for RNs pursuing PhDs in psychiatric nursing.
It has those 200 very well-prepared, doctorally prepared leaders out there who are of color. And they are bringing all across this country new information in. They're working with students, they're working with patients, they're working in Congress, they're working all over in various policy, public health ways. And I'm just delighted to be a part of it. And so it's one thing to deliver care directly, and that is wonderful in and of itself. But then to start shaping the healthcare delivery system to start being part of the decision making. We all know that nursing has got to move there, and this program prepared leadership in that area.
Barbara Nichols was the first black nurse to become president of the ANA. Elected in 1978, she served 2 terms in office. President Nixon's resignation in 1974 signaled the beginning of the end of the Watergate scandal and his active involvement in national politics. That same year, the ANA decided to take its political involvement to a deeper level by establishing a political action committee. There was a need to keep up with the growing complexity of governmental budgeting and appropriations, especially as they related to nursing education.
The ANA has supported, encouraged, pushed all the way along. And indeed, from the time of the mid-70s, if the ANA had not ensured that legislation was introduced to reauthorize the Nurse Training Act, there wouldn't be a Nurse Training Act now. The Nurse Training Act is in place right now in its current modification solely because the ANA originally, and then as time has gone on and there have been other organizations evolved with their support, has ensured that there's been reauthorization of the legislation time after time after time.
Early PAC activities were simplistic by today's standards. Nurses volunteered for candidates at pool parties and set up campaign tables in neighborhood settings. Fundraising activities often took place in private homes. The ultimate goal was to get nurses elected to public office. The ANA PAC evolved dramatically over the years. Healthcare reform pushed the need for political involvement to higher levels. During the 92-94 election cycle, the ANA PAC became the second fastest growing PAC in the country.
I think that we are listened to, we're clearly valued by the public. We have Gallup polls that say nurses are probably one of the top 2 professions in the country who are most valued and listened to by the public. And legislators and candidates know that, and that's why they want nursing support. So in 20 years' time, that is a major turn of events, from the rare nurse who may have spoken out and assumed leadership to it being recognized at every level of government that we need nursing input.
NSTAT, the Nurses Strategic Action Team, is now in place. It has grown to a network of 45,000 nurses who can be mobilized to respond to legislative issues, such as Medicare reimbursement for nurse practitioners. Nearly 70 nurses are currently serving as state legislators. NRN has also been elected to Congress.
Healthcare is in a very difficult position right now. We are really undergoing a revolution, and we have never had a revolution in healthcare before. When you get into a revolutionary state, everything is up for grabs, and it's like someone has taken this very stable cart and turned it upside down. Nurses represent the largest number of healthcare providers in the country, and as a consequence, they are suffering the most from this revolution. The question of the supply of nurses is a tricky one right now. Do we have an oversupply? We have an oversupply of people who are prepared in some of our very basic programs like associate degree and diploma schools. We have an undersupply of people who are prepared in baccalaureate and higher degree programs. And the reason I say that is, as this job market evolves and changes and in fact gets revolutionized, what I see out there is increasing numbers of wonderful opportunities for nurses, but they are not there for people who are not prepared at the higher levels.
The rapidly changing job market has caused stress in the nursing community, especially in California, which has experienced an unprecedented loss of hospital-based jobs. The misleading appeal of job protection on the part of those relying on traditional labor strategies is believed to be responsible for a regretful event in the history of organized nursing. The California Nurses Association voted to disaffiliate from the ANA in the fall of 1995.
I think it is a tragedy that the California Nurses Association saw fit to withdraw from the organization, because I think that the diversity is the strength of the organization. And I once said, when I spoke in California, I said, you know, I think that you can see that a body can live without one leg or one arm, but you never see one leg just walking down the street by itself. And I don't believe that any unit of the organization can live without the rest.
I believe I'm a nurse first, and I happen to be a member of the labor community second. Their identification, I think, is different than that, and therefore they see no problem being a labor organization primarily, working almost exclusively for staff nurses and really for the staff nurse in a hospital setting. I think nursing has larger obligations, has a much broader definition of who we are as nurses, and I really would want to prefer the American Nurses Association model to exist in each state.
ANA California held its constitutional convention in March 1996. This new organization committed itself to coalition building and a program of activism on the part of individuals, families, and the community. Even though efforts at healthcare reform failed in the early 90s, the ANA made a name for itself by being a consistent advocate for quality patient care. The ANA's public policy statement, Nursing's Agenda for Healthcare Reform, was endorsed by over 76 nursing organizations.
It gave us a lot of mileage with consumer groups, with political groups, with other healthcare groups, because we really know what we want for public policy in this country. And so instead of just having a Band-Aid approach like a legislative initiative on one issue, such as does ANA believe in single-payer financing in healthcare, we in fact did a public policy document that could be used for years, and I think it will be used for years.
The ANA faces daunting challenges in this era of market-driven healthcare. The organization begins its second 100 years, having taken definitive steps to chart a steady course through the uncertain waters of today's healthcare revolution. The Nurses' March on Washington in the spring of 1995 supported patients' rights to bedside care and highlighted the danger of replacing RNs with unlicensed personnel. ANA's historic social policy statement was revised in the spring of 1995, emphasizing nursing's responsibility to speak up to protect the public's health. The Nursing Care Report Card has been launched to draw a direct link between nursing care, patient outcomes, and the wise expenditure of health care dollars.
I have an idea that at the end of the road, we are going to feel better about the kind of nursing we're doing than we have ever felt before, in that the things that we always talk about, that is prevention, early detection, screening, patient education, helping patients to take responsibilities for themselves, all those things are very much underlying the new philosophy of healthcare in this country. To be sure, it's financially driven, but our concerns are not, and our concerns for patients are such that I think they all mesh together beautifully.
Nursing is not a job. Nursing is your part of beginning the most exciting career there could be. And it's exciting because of the intimacy, the expertise, the commitment that's required as you work with individuals, families, and communities. And I just don't believe that you can be a careerist nurse without being a part of the American Nurses Association and the State Nurses Association, because nursing will not grow, it will not change, it will not be all that it can be for your patients unless you do get involved in organized nursing, unless you figure out a way to unify yourself with the nurses across the country and to say, you know, we do want appropriate licensure, we do want appropriate reimbursement, we do want to elect officials who are nurse-friendly and health-friendly so that one of these days we can have comprehensive health care in this country. And all these things are part of a puzzle that for me in my life have all come together, and I see them as a part of the whole. And that whole is nursing, and ANA requires activists, powerful people to be in its members. And I would say that a part of your responsibility of being a nurse is to leave nursing better than when you found it.
The difficulties to be encountered, one must truthfully admit, will be mainly of our own manufacture. What we need is energy of purpose, enthusiasm, a spirit of philanthropy more developed, and ambition to lift our profession to a height which the eyes of the nation shall look up and not down. To advance, we must unite.